song that they sang. Thank you so much. It was beautiful. My desire for our congregation and myself is that we continue to fall in love with Jesus. You know how you act when you're in love with someone. You can't get enough of them. You're always thinking about them. You're always calling them. You're always planning the next event so that you could be with them. And so when we fall in love with Jesus, we want to be with him. And if we want to be with him, we begin to act like him. So my prayer is that we will fall in love with Jesus again and again. A priest whose sermon was known to be very long and boring announced in the church on Sunday that he would be transferred to another church and that it was Jesus' wish that he leaves this week. The congregation stood and began to sing, "What a friend we have in Jesus." I love you. Almost as much as I love Jesus. I'm going to ask you to pray with me. And what I want is for us to ask the Holy Spirit to clear our minds and help us to focus on him this morning. Precious and loving God. Oh, how we love you. How we appreciate you. How we thank you for illuminating our minds, igniting our spirits to love you and to love one another. Give us ears to hear what the Spirit would say to us this morning. Help us to take the words that you speak to our hearts and live them and influence our sphere of influence. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and Redeemer. Amen. This was the third time that the disciples had revealed, that Jesus had revealed himself to the disciples. The first time was when he met Mary Magdalene, when she thought he was the gardener. The second time was behind closed doors when he invited Thomas to touch his wounds. And here Jesus reveals himself again to the disciples. This time it's by the Sea of Tiberias, which is another name for the Lake of Galilee. It's quite significant that the disciples were fishing on Lake Galilee. It shows us that since the crucifixion and the previous appearances of Christ, the disciples had given up hope completely and gone home. They had gone back to their professional lives as fishermen. Lake Galilee was about 80 miles from Jerusalem, where Jesus had last appeared to them. The disciples had traveled 80 miles home between appearances. That was no short distance in those days, so they really had given up and gone home. They were not hanging around Jerusalem wondering what comes next. 7 of the disciples were present. the group had disbanded. And so, when Jesus appears to his disciples, he's appearing to broken and vulnerable men who had no sense of hope for the future. Disciples like us, desperately in need of a fresh start with God, desperately in need of finding value and worth and a sense of identity, to know that they are loved and that their lives are worth something. The appearance happens at the crack of dawn. Jesus is standing on the seashore, but the disciples don't recognize him. They are about 100 yards away. They had been fishing all night and had caught nothing. Jesus begins a conversation. Children, have you no food? The words that Jesus uses to address them is paradia. Children. Children, do you have no food? It's an intimate address to his disciples. He doesn't call them men or friends or brothers. He calls them children. He knows how weak and vulnerable they are feeling. He knows how much they are hurting. He knows how much they need to be met with love. And so he calls them children, an indication of the depth of love and a sense of protection over them, much like a parent protecting their child or children. Then Jesus tells them to put their nets down on the other side of the boat, and they will catch fish there. Sure enough, when they follow Jesus' instructions, their net fills up. How about that? When we follow Jesus' instructions, something happens. This story may remind you of an earlier encounter recorded in Luke 5, where Jesus is standing on the shore and says to Simon Peter and his colleagues, "Push the boat out further, let down your nets for a catch." And they do. And they catch so many fish, their net is about to break. This encounter is the calling of disciples to follow Jesus. Follow Jesus. So here is Jesus meeting the disciples after all of their failures during the Passion Week. After they have run away, after they have given up hope and gone back to their old lives, here is Jesus meeting with them in the same way he met with them on day one, doing the same thing that introduced them to him at the beginning. And it's as if he is saying to them, do you remember how it was before all of this mess? Can you remember how it was before fear set in? This mess that caused you to run. It can be like that again. Let's start afresh. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's start again together. I forgive you. And I am still calling you. The call has not been revoked because you betrayed me. I am still calling you. Now this is such a beautiful act of grace and mercy. Jesus is restoring them. It is at this point John recognizes Jesus and shouts, "It's the Lord!" Simon Peter, ever impetuous, tucks his fisherman's smock into his belt and he swims to shore to see Jesus, leaving the other disciples with the hard work of getting the boat back safely to land. When they get back to the land, we are told that Jesus and Peter are sitting together around a charcoal fire where Jesus has prepared breakfast on the seashore. Again, another beautiful detail that shows us the depth of Jesus' restorative love for the disciples. The last time that Jesus and Peter had been together near a charcoal fire was in the courtyard of the high priest Caiaphas. It was on Monday, Thursday, the night that Jesus was being tried. In Luke 22, we are told that Peter sat by the fire in the courtyard while Jesus is being interrogated, and he denies knowing Jesus, and the cock crowed. And in verse 61, the damning words, the Lord turned around and looked straight at Peter. But here they are again, sitting together by a fire. And Jesus again is looking straight at Peter. But this time, there is no element of judgment. This time, there is no element of judgment in his eyes. He sits and he looks at Peter with nothing but compassion and loving kindness. Jesus is restoring him. By now, the others have joined them. And then Jesus says to them, "Bring me some of the fish you have just caught." Another act of compassion and loving kindness. Jesus has already got fish on the fire cooking away. Perhaps the disciples think that they have nothing Jesus needs. They have nothing to offer Jesus whatsoever. He doesn't need them. But Jesus says, no. I want to eat your fish. I value what you have caught. I value what you have to bring to me. Does this remind us of another story in the Gospels? The feeding of 5,000 in John 6. There, a little boy comes to Jesus with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And Jesus looks with compassion on the boy and says, thank you for your gift. That is all I needed. Jesus needs us. All of us. And in the same way here, by accepting the disciples' fish, Jesus is saying that they do have value and worth. What they can offer, it is enough for him. What they can offer is enough for him. So they sit down to eat breakfast together on the seashore. And in verse 13, Jesus gave them the bread. How reminiscent that would be, or have been for the disciples of the last time that Jesus gave them bread at the Last Supper, where the denials, the betrayals, the cowardness had all begun. But here is Jesus sitting with them again, sharing bread, sharing breakfast with them, still offering hospitality, still serving them, still loving them. How many of us would still show hospitality to one who has betrayed us? How many of us would still love in spite of being betrayed? Jesus is restoring them. Then Jesus looks at Simon Peter and he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He uses Simon's full name and title. Simon, John, son of John. Now that's interesting to me because in my experience, full names are used in one of 2 ways. The first is when we are in trouble. I can even still hear now the shout of, Tracey Ivy, come here. How many times have you used that term with your children? Come here. Oh, mercy, I know I'm in trouble. Maybe Simon Peter thinks he's in trouble here when Jesus looks at him and says, Simon, son of John. But a full name is also used when we are about to make a covenant, commitment, or a vow. When an important relational contract is about to be formed. One example would be like in a marriage. A person's full name is used when their vows are being made. In fact, we often hear people say, "Oh, I didn't know your name was." When my family come, you will hear them say, "Tracey Irene, Reenie, Trace." All of those have meaning. Perhaps in this story, by using his full name, Simon, son of John, Peter is not in trouble, but is about to be commissioned for something important. Peter has nothing to fear. Jesus is restoring him. Now let's look at the details of the questions that Jesus asked Peter. In the Greek, there are several meanings for love, different meanings for the word love. In English, we have one word for love, but the Greek has different meanings. In this text, there are two different words. The first, agape, which is to indicate the love of deep fellowship, complete union. The deepest and the most profound type of love there is. Agape. The second word is philo, which indicates brotherly love, deep friendship. So in verse 15, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And the word that Jesus uses is agape. Do you love me with a total and utter commitment? Do you love me with total commitment? Are we in absolute union together? And Simon replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And the word that Simon has replied with is philo. Jesus, I love you. But to be honest, the way I betrayed you and ran away shows that I only love you like a brother, not as I should. Jesus looks at Simon and says, "That's okay. Feed my sheep." Then in verse 16, Jesus does the same thing again. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Agape again. "Simon, aren't you the one who through the years have promised never to leave me? Aren't you the one who has always promised that you would live and die for me? Are you saying that you don't have agape love for me?" And Simon Peter is again confronted by his own weakness and frailty. He says to Jesus, you know I love you. This is philo love, brotherly love. I'm sorry, Lord. I have tried and I have failed. I do love you. I really do. But I can't live up to my own words. I know I brag about my loyalty. I know I thought I was up for the task as a disciple. But at the end of the day, I can't live up to my own standards. Jesus says, that's okay. Trust me. Feed my sheep. Jesus is restoring him. And then a third time, Jesus asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? But this time, Jesus uses the word philo. Simon, you say you have brotherly love for me? But what kind of brother betrays his kinsman? What kind of brother denies even knowing him? What kind of brother runs away to save his own skin? Do you even have brotherly love for me? And then we read in verse 17 that Peter was sad because he knew in his heart of hearts that he could not claim to even have brotherly love. Such was the depth of his sin and betrayal. So Peter replies, Lord, you know all things. You know I love you. And it's philo love, which Peter uses in this place. And yet, he can't even live up to those words. Each of us, when we attend to the truth in our own hearts, we stand as Peter at this moment. We can't live up to our own hearts. We look at Jesus and we sense him looking at us and we say, Lord, I want to love you. You see the difference? I want to love you. I really, really want to do what's right. Hello, God. I want to serve you. My intentions are good, honestly, but I'm weak and I'm frail. I betrayed you. I run away. when the going gets tough. When I don't like what I see, when I don't like what I hear, when people won't give me my way, I run away. My best isn't good enough. But please know, Lord, in my heart of hearts, despite my behavior, I really do love you to the best of my ability. The love I have for you is not what you deserve, but it's the best I can offer. It's the best I can offer. I'm going to need you to help me, Jesus. And Jesus looks you in the eye and me in the eye. And today he says to us, that's okay. The best you have to offer is good enough for me. I love you. No conditions on his love. We put conditions on ours, but there is no conditions on God's love. I forgive you. I want to be with you. Imagine that. You've betrayed him, but he wants to be with you. He wants to be with me. Imagine you can trust me. Today, Jesus is restoring us. And as Jesus restores us, he is asking only one thing of us. Take care of my sheep. You want to know what that looks like? Love one another. Not when things are just going your way. Love one another. Take care of one another. Forgive one another. Have compassion for one another. Show kindness and tolerance and patience toward one another. Share hospitality with one another. That's what Jesus is asking of us today. After all our sin and betrayal, after all of our denying him in our thoughts, our words, and our actions, after all of our cowardness that we have shown through our lives in faith, after all of our apathy in discipleship, after all that Jesus has done, after all of that, Jesus meets with us today, and he says, it's okay. I love you. I love you. if you want to make it better. Just love one another as I have loved you. Did you get that? Not the way you think I should be loved. Love one another as I have loved you. Think about that for a few minutes. I had to. Love one another as I have loved you. No conditions. It's not when I feel like loving you. As I have loved you. Jesus is restoring us. And so we come to the very end of this incredible encounter, an encounter through which Simon Peter is restored, an encounter through which the disciples are restored, an encounter through which we have the assurance that Christ restores us. The closing words in verse 19 are this. Then Jesus said to him, "Follow me." The ultimate act of reconciliation and restoration. Follow me. Jesus finally brings Simon Peter right back to the beginning, right back to his original calling more than 3 years previous.